Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as promised, we are opening up the debate for your questions and your comments. We're very happy to take them. If you have a question to Stephen, it would be great to ask it now, because Stephen will have to leave before the formal end of the debate. So questions about global economy, globalization, the current state of affairs are most welcome. Is there anybody who would like to start the dialogue that we have promised ourselves at the start of this conference? Oh, yes. I'll serve as your host, please. If you may introduce yourself.
Anna Heika. You guys have touched on a lot of political issues, but the fact of the matter is that technology changes the paradigms of politics, of media, of economy. So I would like you to mention the technologies that you think are going to be the most impactful and what the impact is going to be. Thank you.
Okay. Stephen, could you pick up the question?
I can see you from behind me. I can see you on the big screen, so I'm not going to turn around.
Sorry.
So first of all, I, as an economist, I'm very bad at spotting technological trends. I mean, economists are hopeless at this, so I don't want to suggest I can really spot something which is not necessarily going to come through. But I would say the following. I think that technology can be an important driver of globalization, but it can also be used in reverse. If you go back to the sort of North Korean story, if the US decides to bomb North Korea, well, it's technology, but it's technology for a completely different purpose, to changing the world for the better. And actually, I wanted to highlight this with a quote from Davos. I haven't got the precise words, but the quote goes something along these lines, that the wonderful advances of technology suggest that countries will be better connected now than ever before, and that we can move rapidly towards the universal brotherhood of nations. Now, you can imagine someone in Davos today saying exactly those kinds of words. But actually, that quote comes from Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which was set in Davos in 1913. It was published, the book, in 1920s, and of course it's a satire about the optimism that existed before the First World War. And there was a character called Ludovico Settembrini, who was the character who was, if you like, the tech optimist of his day, who basically argued continuously throughout the book that the world's going to be a great place, even though you, as the reader of the book, know exactly what happens the year after the book is set in. As a modern-day variant of that, it seems to me that one aspect of technology that's often overlooked is the way in which social media has moved us away from truth towards reinforcement of existing beliefs. And that, I think, is quite worrying, A, because it means that political arguments become less based on truth and more about marshalling people to support you, regardless of whether what you're saying is true or not. But also it means that beliefs that hitherto might be regarded as fairly toxic can become increasingly acceptable. So whereas when the internet first came through, people saw this as a way of creating truth, of destroying authoritarianism, of creating a better world, it seems to me that in the social media outlook that we have today, there is more a case of reinforcing existing beliefs rather than necessarily going for truth. And that, I think, is a very frightening trend.
I think we have two questions registered. A gentleman here, and I will pass on the mic to
Hello, Marek Rzutowski, Grayling. I have a rather brief and bold question referring to what Prime Minister Morawiecki was saying. Do you believe the Washington consensus is really that we need a new compact, economic and social compact, to tackle some of the issues that you were referring today?
Yeah, we'll take the second one from Michał, and then we'll let Stephen answer.
Michał Baranowski, German Marshall Fund of the United States. Thank you very much, and great to see lots of good friends on the panel. Thank you for the very interesting discussion. Well, one sort of general question, and listening to Prime Minister Morawiecki, now listening to you, we are seeing a future that looks quite differently. And I guess one question that, without scaring anyone too much, do you see this transition being a smooth transition, or at your gut level and sort of intellectually, do you see something, well, catastrophic is a little bit strong word, but a quick change to the current international, through the current international system? Connecting it to North Korea, if I just may, we talked about what's going on over there, but it's a question, well, to Nathalie and Tomáš maybe the most. I mean, if you can connect it to the European security. If something happens there, what do you think would happen here? Thanks.
So first of all, on the Washington Consensus, even if one were to believe that the Washington Consensus was still good, you wouldn't dare mention it evermore in polite company because it's being treated as such a sort of nasty group of values that are damaging for countries in different parts of the world. What I think has particularly changed is a sense of international capital being allocated or misallocated rather than doing good things. And I think the first signs of difficulty with the Washington Consensus, frankly, came through in the 1990s, but not so much in Europe or the US. They came through in Asia with the Asian crisis, which was partly a consequence of liberalization of capital accounts in Asia in the mid-1990s, leading to huge inflows into parts of Asia, which of course became even more rapid outflows when things went wrong. And from that point of view, the international institutions that had originally supported the idea of capital account liberalization have themselves changed their minds. So the IMF, for example, is much less enthusiastic about these sorts of things today than might have been the case back in the 1990s. Part of that, I think, is because some of the Asian countries reimposed capital controls and seem to come out of it pretty well, like, for example, Malaysia. And part of it is because China has not liberalized its capital account completely and yet has had tremendous economic success. So I think there's been a rethink to a certain degree of aspects of the Washington Consensus for those reasons alone. But beyond that, I think there's also this issue that the Washington Consensus never really dealt with the issue of income inequality, wealth inequality, and those are much more important political issues today than was the case in the past. Final point is that if the Washington Consensus is partly about movements of capital across borders and the efficient allocation of that capital, well, the global financial crisis suggests that that particular aspect of the story no longer looks quite so coherent. So I think for all those reasons, it's not as attractive a story as might have been the case previously. The problem, of course, we've got nothing to replace it with, so there's a lot of uncertainty as to how countries should run their economies. As for the longer-term story or the risks of something going horribly wrong, you're all much more expert than this than I am. But one thing I would note is this, that going back to the Russia story, the China story, I think we have now got a sense of competition for who effectively sets institutional arrangements up for different parts of the world. It's partly because the US is no longer as big as it used to be. It shrunk as a share of global GDP. It's partly because, although I recognize that Putin's tune they've changed recently, there's a sense of Russia rebuilding some aspects of its imperial past that wasn't there perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, but has begun to come back as a theme. I think it's also because China is creating institutions today which are not dissimilar from the Bretton Woods institutions, but are designed to further Chinese interests in the world. So I'm thinking here of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, most obviously the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is there to fund China's Belt and Road initiatives. And it just strikes me that when you have these rival international institutions being created, it's a little similar to something that emerges not so much from Grave New World, or indeed Brave New World, which is ultimately a utopian nightmare, but rather from a dystopian nightmare, namely 1984 by George Orwell, because in Orwell's book, he describes three sort of big global powers rivaling each other and constantly either two against one at war with each other. And those three rival powers are Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia. And if you simply change those names to the US, China, and Russia, you have something which may not be a million miles away from some of the strains and stresses that are beginning to emerge in the world economy today. And that raises rather an interesting question, which is that for Europe, I think there's a very tricky choice out there, because in a nutshell, I would suggest that we've lived through for actually hundreds of years now what we might describe as a post-Columbus world, which was originally centered on Europe, spread through to Europe's effective colonies elsewhere in the world, which then became independent, of course, with the US. But you've got this kind of European version of history. And with the rise of China and so on, you've now got what I think is the return to a pre-Columbus world, a sort of story whereby you have a Eurasian theme beginning to emerge. And then the reason why it raises an interesting question for Europe is that the economic opportunity may be to the east, but the east is not the natural home of liberal democracy. And how that evolves in the years ahead, I think is not clear, but I think it's an area of tremendous uncertainty for Europe itself.
Nathalie, would you like to co-answer the question posed by Michał?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, and as I guess the Italian in the room, I cannot answer this question without citing Antonio Gramsci, meaning the question on the global transition. Because I think his words back then are extremely pertinent today. We know where we're coming from. The old order is dying, but we don't know where we're going to. The new order is yet to come into being. And in that transition period of shades of light and shadows is the time of monsters. And I think it's the time of monsters precisely because we know where we're coming from, a particular power configuration at the global level, which in turn led to a particular configuration of rules and norms. I mean, the two cannot be disentangled from one another. But we don't know what that power configuration is going to look like in future. And we don't know it because whereas we may know some elements of it, power shifting to the east, we also know that power will diffuse and is diffusing beyond the confines of the nation states. We know that power does not mainly reside within a particular actor, but because of particularly technological developments will flow between actors. So we're basically in a brand new world here. And so we cannot quite know what the norms and rules that will embed that power configuration are gonna look like. Now, does that time of monsters therefore mean that there will be a major war against Russia or a nuclear attack by North Korea or the definitive implosion of the Middle East? Well, hopefully not, not necessarily. Does it mean that this period of instability and chaos is going to be with us for years and possibly decades to come? I would say definitely yes.
So get accustomed to crisis and instability. There were two questions in line. I understand, sorry, I'm trying to use two microphones, which is not a good idea. One from Kuba and another one from Jan as a follow-up.
Thank you very much. Jakub Wojnarowski, ACCA Poland. My first question really is related to another power that was not mentioned during the discussion, which is China. Stefan tried to put some remarks on China in answering to the question on the Washington Consensus, but my question relates to whether the Chinese initiatives like Belt and Road and other activities that are run there can have a significant impact on the economy and politics in the current year. That's the first question. The second question is related, if I may, related to the Brexit process. 2 months ago, EU and UK agreed to move to the second stage of the negotiations. Does it mean that we can expect more smooth exit, or shall we expect something different that we supposed to happen at least half a year ago or a year ago? Thank you very much.
I think this is an easy one, given the fact that you're meant to leave in 2 minutes, but I understand you'll stay with us.
Okay, so on the China question of Belt and Road, China has had, in one sense, a relatively easy time of it in terms of its development over the last 30 or 40 years. By easy, I mean that it's the eastern coastal provinces that have grown rapidly. They've been engaged with the rest of the world. The inland parts of China have remained relatively poor. One of the reasons why Belt and Road is so important is that it connects those inland parts of China with other parts of Asia. But it also creates a risk, namely, how does the rest of Asia react to their economic relationship with China? And here I think this is a situation where China is more out of control of what it wants to achieve than it might have been in the past. That I think itself is a high risk factor. It's also worth noting when you think about the creation of the belt, which is effectively the land-based part, as opposed to the road, which is oddly enough the sea-based part. The road will travel through parts of Asia which themselves may be unpredictable or difficult in the future. Going back to the energy topic, the issue of how you diversify away from energy in the future, it is possible to say that Russia, Iran, and so on could be in significant difficulties in the years ahead if we move towards a post-fossil fuel world. And in those circumstances, maybe you have political instability right on China's borders in the case of Russia, and not very far away in the case of Iran. So you've got those kinds of difficulties out there. On Brexit, I wish I knew. You've got to bear in mind that in Britain at the moment, every day there's a new newspaper article about the civil war going on within the Conservative Party, who are the people supposed to know what they want from Brexit. And so, in a nutshell, it comes down to the fact that, the way I put it, is that the EU is offering Britain a series of set menus. There's set menu A, the set menu B, the set menu C. And Britain wants to have an a la carte series of choices. We want this bit and that bit and the other bit, regardless of what the EU wants to say to us. And
we like to go to restaurants with set menus.
Well, exactly, it's true. But I think, so for example, there are many people in Britain who think that we should leave the EU but should be part of the single market or maybe at least the customs union. Those who are pure Brexiteers, so to speak, would say, well, if we have that, we can't so easily negotiate trade deals with other parts of the world, so life becomes increasingly uncomfortable. But it also creates problems, of course, if you go for the hard exit, particularly in terms of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So each way you look at it, there's a mess. There's a compromise that has to be reached. But each of the people within the party seems unwilling so far to compromise. And in the absence of compromise within the Conservative Party of the UK, it's difficult to work out how Europe can negotiate a settlement that works for Europe and the UK together. So basically the Conservatives have to resolve their inner tensions before anything else really gets done.
Great. There was a question from Jan.
Jan Petrowski, I have a question for Stephen. The one part of the world which has not been mentioned in this conversation is South America. And South America, after being scarred by heterodox economic policies for about a decade, I'm specifically thinking of Argentina and Brazil, they're rediscovering the Washington Consensus, and actually quite enthusiastically, and at a time when everybody else is turning away from it. Do you think that there's a chance that other parts of the world, including the West, will rediscover the Washington Consensus before it's too late?
Well, on Latin America, part of the rediscovery is because they've been through a pretty miserable time over the course of the last few years. But it's worth noting that they also went through miserable times when they adopted the Washington Consensus. There's been ups and downs for Latin America. And going back to your comment specifically in Argentina, the issue with Argentina is not so much what's happened over the last 10 or 20 years. It's rather what's happened over the last 120 or 130 years. But this is a country that has been prone to booms and busts continuously, decade after decade after decade. And it reflects partly a very low level of domestic savings, a dependency on capital coming in from the rest of the world, but also sometimes an inadequacy to protect the interests of those who invest in Argentina. So things go well, then go badly, then go well, then go badly. It's been a sort of persistent story over many, many years. So yes, they are rediscovering the Washington Consensus, but at the moment their performance has been subpar relative to the rest of the world. It may get better, but unless it does get better significantly, then I think people will look at it and say it's not an experiment that's worked particularly well.
Great.
I think I have to go. I'm sorry
yes,
about this.
we were sorry to see you leaving, but thank you very much for being part of the debate. Please give a round of applause to Stephen. We are very well prepared with our panelists to answer further questions which may arise regarding the EU, the North Korean issue, Trump and the US, and also Russia and security relations. Are there any questions which we could take now from the audience? Further. As you take your time to think about further geopolitical questions, I wanted to come back to Nathalie and ask about your home country, which is Italy. Because one of the elections we haven't spoken until now about is the Italian election, which seems to be an important factor in Eurozone discussions on where to go further.
Spoil your lunch here.
So, since you took a shot at Poland, we now have to take a shot at Italy. Give us a fast-forward look at where the Italian election is heading and what are we to expect in the Eurozone and Europe from Italy?
Well, nothing good is the short answer. I think, and here
you're being unpatriotic.
Very definitely. And here I'll very quickly reveal my political colours in case anyone had any doubts. I mean, basically, I think we are playing with three possible scenarios. And it goes from disaster to bad. Bad is, brace yourself, a resurrection of Berlusconi. That's the best possible outcome that we can hope for.
You said resurrection.
A resurrection,
okay.
Yeah, the phoenix rising from his ashes. So basically some sort of grand coalition tilted to the right, meaning with Berlusconi's party having the lion's share together with the Democrat Party. Now that bad scenario is the least likely, in my view. Then you go to what I consider to be the most likely, which is basically a right-wing coalition, which is a coalition with Berlusconi, with the Northern League, and with Fratelli d'Italia, that is basically sort of post-fascist party. And that is the most likely scenario. And then you have the disaster scenario, which is the Five-Star Movement together with the Northern League. Now, most Italians would dismiss it, this disaster scenario, but I'm actually not so optimistic about this. I think there is a bit of a natural tendency, and we've seen it before Brexit, we saw it before the election of Donald Trump, of simply not wanting to contemplate that disaster is a real possibility. And I think, you know, we may be there in the case of Italy. Now, there is a silver lining to it. So politically, an absolute disaster. I really don't see any good outcome moving forward.
Just domestically or also for Europe?
Well, this is the silver lining. The silver lining is that I don't think that even in the most disastrous political outcome, the policy consequences when it comes to Italy itself, but then in relation to Europe, are actually going to be all that much. Now, the state in Italy has this incredible ability to contain. Now, it tends to contain even when good things happen, meaning, you know, you have good laws being passed and they're not implemented. I mean, if we think, you know, for those of you who will recall back 2012, Mario Monti had sort of passed measures for major spending reviews. 2018 has not been implemented yet. But of course it has its positive sides, meaning, you know, you have a disaster government coming in and saying it wants to, whatever, it won't do this, but even saying it wants to hold whatever referendum on the euro, it won't happen. So actually I think when it comes to Europe, the implication of this pretty grim political scenario moving forward is not so much that it will have a major consequence on Europe, it's rather that Italy will not play the role that it could be playing in this relaunch of the European project that we were discussing earlier.
There is a question from the Australian ambassador who bears a Polish name.
Wawrzyniec, Ambassador of Australia. Thank you very much. Well, actually, I come from a very happy country, but unfortunately my question is more about the catastrophic. I wanted to use the amazing panel we have here, colleagues particularly from US, and also experts in Russia and North Korea, to ask about nuclear weapons. I'm just wondering, given last week's release of a US new report on nuclear weapons, I think the posture review it was called, are we seeing a significant change in the way nuclear weapons are seen as a weapon in terms of perhaps use of smaller devices, our doctrine on the use of them changing, and what's the likely impact of a discussion on the use of those weapons, but particularly reactions from Russia and of course any implications on developments in North Asia as well. Thank you.
I think this is a missile which heads your way, Cristina, and then Tomáš.
Yeah, absolutely. So the US NPR did come out last Friday. I've only skim read it so far, so I have to apologise that I've not got my teeth into it. But absolutely, it does reflect some concerning changes to US nuclear weapons policy. The primary one being the one you mentioned about the change in yield and smaller nuclear devices being used. A lot of the framing of that has been focused on Russia. Yeah, I personally find that a little bit hard to believe based on Russian capabilities of detection, and actually that those smaller devices are probably more likely to be aimed at lower level conflict, possibly on the Korean Peninsula. However, that said, it does not exclude messaging to Russia in terms of European deterrence. I think there is a slight silver lining, despite the concern that lowering the nuclear threshold does bring, in that it could open the door for parity in negotiations of arms control with Russia going forward. One of the big issues in progressing arms control with Russia, between the US and Russia, has been the stalling point of the US wanted to talk about Russia's tactical nuclear weapons, so those lower yield weapons, and Russia absolutely categorically saying no, that is not on the table for discussion. So although I absolutely do not agree with the lowering of the nuclear threshold through smaller devices, By integrating those capabilities, it puts them on the table for negotiation. So I'm skeptical of that, but it's a concept worth exploring. It's something worth exploring there. For the more broad debate on how we're seeing nuclear weapons and how we're thinking about nuclear weapons, I think the run-up to 2020 is going to be an incredibly politically difficult time. 2020, we had the Non-Proliferation Review Conference, and the big shadow over that, not only is the NPR, but the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. So the non-proliferation community right now is at an incredibly difficult crossroads. We've not had a successful non-proliferation review treaty conference in quite a long time. And the prospect for consensus and a successful 2020 conference is looking increasingly slim. The conversation and dialogue between the P5 is not looking fruitful at all, mostly because of the US-Russia relationship. And you have those who are wanting to drive disarmament efforts forward, potentially leaning towards the ban treaty and looking for alternatives to make that happen. If there is an increased move towards a greater reliance on nuclear weapons in military postures again, that division is only going to become more and more entrenched, which could damage the NPT quite significantly. And then we face the possibility of being left without a forum for genuine disarmament talks in which the P5 members all participate in.
Great. Tomáš, would you like to follow up on the Russia issue?
Well, closer to home, there has been a change in Russian nuclear posture and doctrine, which is alarming. And this is really the one big difference between the old days of the Cold War and this, whatever it is, the relationship we have with Russia now. When you study Russian doctrine, when you look at the exercises they conduct, when you look at the documents they release, it's fairly clear that they envision a use of nuclear weapons, small nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons nevertheless, fairly early on in a crisis. The idea is that they believe that they have a stronger will to act than we do, and that the resolve is our central weakness, and the way to weaken the resolve even further, fatally perhaps, to the point where NATO, whatever combination of states, decides not to fight. The way to put us in that situation is by detonating a nuclear weapon earlier on in a conflict, using against the forces that were moving to the area, or simply as a means of demonstration, assuming that our public opinions will do the rest, and the headlines will do the rest. Now that's a really tricky issue for us to wrestle with. It's a very different relationship from the one we had during the Cold War, where both sides essentially, after years of working this through, settled on a use of nuclear weapons that was fairly highly political. I mean, it was basically keeping these large strategic arsenals as a way of making sure they both have a capacity to destroy each other, and thus deterring any sort of a sneak attack. But it was a fairly balanced relationship. This isn't. This is a fundamentally, qualitatively very different one, and coupled with Moscow's unwillingness to engage in any sort of an arms control, because they seem to believe that unpredictability, uncertainty, kicking up dust works for them well. They are weak conventionally so by not disclosing what exactly you have, and by kicking up dust, possibly seeming more bellicose and aggressive than you really are. You throw off the enemy. This particular mindset means that they are not willing to engage in any meaningful arms control debate. So the combination of almost no conversation on what is it actually that they mean to do with the nuclear weapons, us literally leading the tea leaves and analyzing the exercises, and a very strong possibility of a far more aggressive posture on the Russian side is worrisome. Now the US nuclear, and I'll end with this, the US nuclear posture does try to deal with it. It deals with it by essentially, to some extent, mirroring the Russian doctrine by moving or calling for a move towards smaller nuclear weapons. It seems sensible on a first glance. It still doesn't address the question of will. Would you actually use those weapons? Are the Russians wrong to calculate that the public resolve is weaker on our side than theirs? And it doesn't address the question of alliance unity. The United States has moved. We have in NATO a country that has actually agreed to join negotiations on nuclear disarmament, and that, at least on paper, believes that signing a treaty that completely bans nuclear weapons is the right thing. 2 other countries came close to it, but were talked out of it by the United States in the last moment. So we have homework to do on essentially agreeing a new NATO nuclear policy for this age, and it's going to be a bloody difficult conversation.
Before we go to the next 2 questions which are in line, I have a surprise for you. I would like to fill the seat in the panel. As you might remember, if you have been at Risk and Trends last year, we are having a small forecasting tournament with US participants. We asked 15 questions last year regarding geopolitics, the global economy, and local politics, and we have a winner. We have somebody who managed to correctly predict 13 out of the 15 questions, to answer correctly 13 out of the 15 questions. I wanted the winner to collect the prize, and the winner is Mr. Karol Pogorzelski, an economist in ING Bank, who, as I said, there are 3 prizes, there are 3 presents. One is the prize that you get for the best insight for 2017. The second is a subscription to PI Finance, our new service on financial sector, and the third is actually a demand for you to join our panel, please. We are really happy to have you here, and I hope that your colleagues from ING will bring the good news to the economic department at the bank. We are going to launch another tournament this year, but this will come at the end of the session. But there are 2 more questions which were in line, and the gentleman here wanted to ask one of them.
Thank you. My name is Julio Bravo, I'm the ambassador of Chile. And my question is more related to Secretary Tillerson's trip to Latin America. After 1 year, he's for the first time visiting our region, and he warned the countries of Latin America of the trade level that we are having with China. And he also dared to say that this is a new imperialism of China. Most of the Latin American countries have replaced the US as the main trade partner, mainly Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and Peru, and Colombia also in the same line. So my question is related to this position. How is do you see the participation of China in Latin America, and if this can be connected as a new imperialism, the way that we understand imperialism, when it's just not only trade, it's just only that you want to also impose a political system.
Thank you. Who'd like to pick up the question? Okay.
Well, I think that, unfortunately, from my perspective, it's no surprise. My comment won't be a surprise that President Trump ran on a very anti-trade platform. It resonated with enough people that he was elected. Although I'd point out that he did not get a plurality of the votes. Secretary Clinton did. I do not see any desire in the administration to pursue free trade, either agreements or the principles of free trade. And that was made clear in the initial days of the administration, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think will, it's not much commented on, but I think will go down as one of the first and perhaps larger flaws of policymaking in this administration. The renegotiation of NAFTA, of the North America Free Trade Agreement, which doesn't seem to take into account the many benefits, not just for the people of Mexico and Canada, but people of the United States, particularly automobile manufacturing sector, but also the stability it's brought to the Mexican economy. So we've had a little bit of gloominess in this panel, and unfortunately, and I wish I could dispel it, but I can't when you ask me about U.S. trade policies, unfortunately. I apologize.
So you're looking for a question which will ungloom our debate. Hopefully one will come from Anders Aslund.
Anders Åslund from the Atlantic Council. Listen to Tomáš Valášek, and I completely agree with what you said, but I wanted to draw you out a bit further from your judicious picture. As you rightly pointed out, this does not look good for Russia. And a few points. Nobody expects anything good whatsoever from Putin for his next term. And Putin cannot get people to a mass meeting, while Navalny can get them anywhere at any time. This doesn't look very strong. And this is a kleptocracy. The top of Russia, Putin's cronies, are stealing a few tens of billions of dollars each year. And since there are no property rights in Russia, even for them, they take the money out. There's something like $1 trillion of private Russian assets abroad. And these are essentially in two countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, that allow massive anonymous companies, which makes it potentially weak if these two countries changes their legislation. I thought you were quite judicious also saying that you don't see any immediate war. The Syria war and the war in eastern Ukraine has not got well. But what about withdrawing from Donbass to break up sanctions that are really hitting Russia now? Can you see something that could come out if you try to speculate a little bit what could be a positive thing coming out of the situation? Thank you.
If we may just, since you got quite a big question and thank you very much. We'll take a second one from the gentleman in the back.
Yes, hello, good morning. Ben Palmer, a Brit working for a US defense and security company, Northrop Grumman. I'm afraid I didn't want to, or didn't feel able to lift the gloom. I was going to bring us back to Russia as well. And I think you asked Thomas earlier on to speculate about where we would be in 10 years. And I think he very deftly sidestepped that particular hospital pass because it's very difficult to predict. But I was very struck by the way you framed the question. You framed the question in terms of a Russian invasion of a NATO ally. And I just wondered whether the panel, Tomáš and the panel more broadly, thought that was the right way to think about the Russian threat. Is it actually a question of thinking in binary terms about the incursion of sovereignty in a physical sense? Or isn't there quite a lot that we could expect the Russians to want to do, as they've been doing, to continue to do, which will fundamentally assault the ways in which we in the West think about the way we live our lives? And I want to be interested to sort of explore that slightly more broadly.
Sure. I use the word invasion with regard to Donbass, not with regard to any Russian plans for NATO. I stand by it. I think it's fairly clear. What was happening in August 2014 is that the Ukrainian army was on the verge of defeating the forces in Luhansk and Donetsk, and was aided by a massive influx of regular and irregular Russian forces into eastern Ukraine. If that's not an invasion, I'm not sure what is. But I didn't refer to the most likely sort of confrontation we as a Western community, NATO, EU, have with Russia as invasion. That's not my word, because it's not by far the most likely one. It would be foolish. It would be hitting us where we're strong, and you know, the Russians are a number of things, but they're neither naive nor stupid. Therefore, you know, the context, the scenario in which I worry about an actual military confrontation is actually one arising out of misunderstanding. Because again, I think at the end of the day, notwithstanding the points I have made earlier about Russia thinking through and exercising a war in which actually wins against us, I still think it's such a disastrous scenario with the actual possibility of going spectacularly against Russia should our resolve turn out to be stronger than it assumes. And it has already turned out to be stronger on the EU sanctions. Who would have thought that we would be, in 2018, treating them as a routine matter that's rolled over as a matter of, without discussion. So notwithstanding that what I had said earlier about Russian preparations for war. I do not believe that they would want to enter in any calculated way into any confrontation with an actual use of military force, given that the preponderance of forces is so clearly and evidently and visibly at the end of the day in the final accounting on our side. So what is it that they continue to try to do? And we have already alluded to that. It's a sense of destabilizing and simply sapping the will through either encouraging, a combination of encouraging extremist forces which then question the basic tenets of the democratic societies. We've seen it with financing via Czech-Russian bank of Marine Le Pen in France, the clear financial support that goes to extreme right forces, basically open fascist forces in Hungary and elsewhere. It's sowing discord and chaos into the information field via social media, the sort of things that Twitter and Facebook at last are reporting about in great detail. To what purpose? Do they really mean to change our minds? They're not trying to. They're not even attempting to present a different narrative. The idea is simply to sow confusion and to sap the trust and faith that people put in the elites and in the competence of the elites, so that in times of trouble, when the same elites try to rally the publics of their countries into confrontation and mobilization, they'll find out they don't have the support. That's clearly the way conflict will go. It's playing itself out. Military force is the last resort. Russia will be foolish again to hit us where we're strong. Really quickly to answer this question, do I see anything good coming out of Russia? The irony is you're far better expert on Russia than I am. I spent a week in Russia in December. That doesn't make me nearly as strong on the subject as you are, Anders. I went to Moscow in December hopeful that I might find something good to report on the Donbass, capitalizing on what, again, pollsters and others in Russia tell me about the sense of fatigue and overextension that the Russians genuinely now seem to want to pull back. They want their government to do fewer foreign interventions, fewer foreign adventures. That seems to be real, and Putin is responding to that. So I went to Moscow asking we might see an actual beneficiary effect, therefore, on the Kurt-Volker-Surkov talks, on the bilateral US-Russian talks, on some sort of a peaceful resolution to Donbass, which would be great, in this bleak sea of gloom and doom. One encouraging thing. Well, I found nothing encouraging to report out of Moscow. What I found was a city that was completely enthralled by the Robert Mueller investigation. Those in the room who know Russia better than I will roll their eyes. There's a tendency on the Russian side to always assume everything is about them. And when I tried to explain the Mueller investigation wasn't about them, it's about Trump and about upholding US law in the face of something important, US elections, integrity of US elections, they wouldn't accept that. Surely this is all about us. It's after coming up with a new excuse for sanctions. They by then had intelligence and information that this list was coming out. That's what the obsession in Moscow was all about. In an ironic way, it's this obsession with the Mueller probe that has underlined completely any confidence on the Russian side that the talks with Kurt Volker, Ambassador Volker, make any sense. Because the way the Russians tell it is, the only thing that US has to promise to us and to deliver that we can actually want from it is relief from sanctions. Otherwise, we're sitting pretty in Donbass, right? It hasn't gone the way we wanted it to. It's turned out to be more complicated, more bloody, but it's affordable, it's manageable. We have Ukraine kind of where we want it to. So the only reason for us to move, really, to change our policy is if the US could credibly lift or promise to lift sanctions. But of course the United States isn't going to do that because the United States is obsessed with punishing Russia at any cost. Again, Mueller is looking for more evidence, for more sanctions. The United States is inherently has turned irreconcilably antagonistic towards us. And I walked away adding to your doom and gloom with a sense that as encouraging as on some levels the change in Russian attitude should be, and it should put us in a better place for possible settlement on Donbass, it hasn't because of their complete unremitting focus on and conviction that the United States, via the Mueller probe, is out to punish Russia.
Please go.
If I can just ask a follow-up question. I'm glad to hear that Moscow's as absorbed with the Mueller investigation as Washington is. But say, for example, what I consider to be a likely outcome, which is the Mueller investigation, it concludes by the end of the year. Let's say it doesn't lead to an impeachment proceeding against Trump. So the Mueller investigation's behind us. Then do you think the Russians would be more interesting to engage with the Volcker negotiations? How would that change the dynamic?
Well, let me repay the honor and answer a question with a question, which is that I guess much would depend in the Russian mind and final analysis on whether they conclude at that point that the Congress also ceases to be hostile to the to Russia. What I mean by this is what the Russians see, and not wrongly, is a complete dichotomy on Russia in Washington. You have a president who is clearly unwilling to impose sanctions. He has produced a list of individuals apparently copied and pasted from the Kremlin, or from Forbes 500, right? And has refused to back it up with any single steps of substance and the reimposition of sanctions or imposition of new sanctions. What you have also seen, however, Congress suspecting the president of being less than a man of integrity on Russia, actually tightening and putting the president in this trap where if he actually lifts sanctions, they'll be immediately imposed back via a congressional action, which is, of course, far more difficult to lift. From the Russian perspective, and I'm really now speculating, but trying to think as a former negotiator, I would probably want to have some sort of a certainty that if I'm going to engage with Washington seriously, that Congress hasn't changed it's what the Russians now see as irreconcilably hostile attitude to Moscow. So my question to you is, even if the Mueller probe concludes, even if the president is exonerated, what will the Senate do? What will Senator McCain do? What will Senate Democrats do? Will they change their minds on Russia fundamentally?
No, I don't believe so. And I think the president's view on Russia, which you can call it credulous or friendly, whatever adjective you want to use, is an outlier both within the Republican Party and certainly within the Democratic Party. And that's not for partisan reasons. I mean, there are many criticisms of him that may be partisan, but that's not partisan. I mean, Russia's an issue that unites people from the hawkish spectrum in the United States to the more human rights side of the spectrum. So I don't see any change regardless of what the Mueller investigation concludes.
I always think that's a great moment when participants in the panel start to self-moderate themselves and ask questions each other. It's not irony, I really like it. It shows that we are in dialogue. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to come back to you with the simplistic question that I asked at the very beginning. I know experts hate simplistic questions. Could you give, in the fire round that we are entering now, a response to the question, what's the name of the historical period we are in, starting with Gordon?
I would say it's the era of the driverless car. Mm-hmm. The reason I use that metaphor is there's a great deal of uncertainty and in some quarters fear about the rise of technology. There's a great deal of concern that we're no longer in concern of our destinies. I think we see that in areas as disparate as the rise of nativism in some countries, the rise of religious fundamentalism, and other phenomena where people no longer feel that they control their own destinies the way they used to.
Driverless cars.
I'm going to echo that a little bit, and I would say it's the wilderness period. I feel like we're in a time where a certain proportion of the society, and I think maybe it's generational, are trying to push in one direction, and those who are still clinging on to maybe the past 2 decades are trying to pull back. And you know, whether it's state-based, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, there seems to be a bit of a mishmash in the middle of not really knowing what direction we're going in, and we're still trying to figure out together, hopefully, how we can collectively move forward and get through the challenges that we're facing now.
Could you just repeat the phrase that you used because I didn't get it?
Wilderness.
Wilderness, okay. The area of wilderness.
Well, I may have misunderstood. I thought you were asking for a historical metaphor, as in what's this 2018 like? And the only obvious answer is, it's like, I think the closest metaphor is the Russian Revolution of 1918. What I don't know is whether we're in February 1918 or in October 1918, to use the Russian calendar.
And where we are sitting in
Moscow.
And
to develop that in 10 seconds or less, well, or maybe a little more, is, you know, there's been a revolution in a sense. A lot of the assumptions we took completely for granted 10, 11 years ago that, you know, the West will continue to grow and remain dominant, the rest will become like us. Prosperity, democracy, stability in Europe will continue to enlarge. We will all get richer and the wealth will trickle down from the top eventually to the rest of us. A lot of those are now gone. What you see is a lot of quackery, a lot of snake oil salesmen trying to sell their own prescriptions and to sell revolutionary ideas that don't work. I don't know whether we'll have the common sense and the wherewithal, and whether the elites have enough, and whether the whole simple idea of knowledge and wisdom and expertise has enough remaining traction to make the case that just because your car has broken down, you don't go back to horses. Mm-hmm. You fix the car. And I just don't know whether we are, again, I think the February 1918 was the moment where there was an opportunity to fix the car. By October 1918, the decision was made to go back to the horse. And I just hope that we're back to, we're still in the February period, and there's a hope of avoiding the October outcome.
Nathalie, you partially gave an answer, but I'll be quizzing you for another one. So.
Yeah, indeed. My metaphor is indeed the monsters, with the monsters being the nationalism and the nativism and the closure and the protectionism. And the reason why those monsters are popping up their heads, or rather the reason why they're not being sufficiently contained, is because the norms and the rules and the institutions that we've been used to are simply too weak in this process of transition to make sure that containment, if not complete diffusion or eradication, takes place.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to give it a shot?
Yes, of course.
Great.
And I would like to go more of a big picture and follow the rule of naming ages by the material. So we've had a Bronze Age and a Steam Age, and I think we are all living in a plastic age. Age of plastic, like this is the material all the things we're dealing with is made of. And I think, when I'm thinking about it, is that it's quite a nice, nice name, because plastic is something very diverse. Lots of things are made from plastic, so it's not like a steel where you have only few things like swords made of it, and lots of things not. Everything is made from plastic. Another thing is no one really knows how plastic is made. So there are lots of types of plastic. It's somehow made from oil, but no one really knows how. And the last thing is that plastic is very flexible. So I would tell that we live in times where are very fluid, like plastic, very diverse, and no one really knows how does it work.
It's also a great metaphor for artificiality, which is part of our problem with both intelligence and politics these days, a lot of artificiality in politics. I want actually to grill you a little bit more. We just have 2 or 5 minutes left. And since you were correct on your forecast last year, what is your forecast for GDP growth in Poland for 2018?
I work in a team, so...
Okay, the team's forecast.
So I would tell that our team's forecast is that the growth in Poland will be around 4.4% per year. And if I may, I would like to reveal my strategy for last year's voting.
Okay.
Because there was a strategy. There was not a pure guesswork.
Have we been gamed?
Yes.
Okay.
But not by me, but by the reality, I think. So there were a couple of questions on macroeconomics when I went with my team's forecasts of ING, which was very good. But there were couple of questions I did not know what the answer is, and I did not have a defined opinion on them. So I thought that the year before was the year of Trump and of Brexit, and everyone was thinking revolutionary. That something big should happen in 2017, and I thought that people usually overestimate the importance of current events and the importance of politics in shaping our reality. So I thought I would vote each of the questions like nothing would change.
Okay.
So the opposite, which won the competition, of course.
So you have interpreted...
and managed me to get 13 out of 15 answers correct. But I also understand that the strategy is good for one people and bad for the others. Like when you're thinking global, probably the answer nothing much would change this year would be a good answer. But if you're exposed to very particular risks, you're looking for something different at all, and for other experts, not on forecasts on everything in the world, but on this very specific area.
Great. So you're forecasting also on the basis of sentiment, which is a renowned also method of interpreting Davos. If the Davos crowd is saying everything is going down the drain, then things are probably in control. And when Davos, as it was this year, is all happy, then we are probably in for a crisis, which I hope we won't be talking about here, because we don't want to be doomers. Now, there is one more thing I wanted to tell you, which is related to what the Prime Minister alluded to. Yes, we have published last year a very interesting report on EU competition and the way that different countries are being treated by European institutions. I haven't written that report myself, just for the record, as the Prime Minister implied. It was written by our research team, on commission from Fakro, a Polish company, who asked us to review the way that the European Commission is treating companies from different member states. So I very strongly recommend you to download that report. It's both in Polish and in English. It should be, I think, today, our IT programmer says it is already on the website. So even if you are not a subscriber of Polityka Insight, you can go to politykainsight.pl, then go to EN if you prefer English, and download the report in order to review it for yourself. It is part of our tailored research offering that we have for companies who would like to do some research with us. Now, I wanted you to all to ask you all to give a warm round of applause for our brilliant panelists.